Pearl Zane Grey's pioneer heritage was imprinted on his name at birth on January 31, 1872. His ancestors had been early settlers of Ohio. Reportedly, the name Pearl came from the mourning attire of Queen Victoria that newspapers at that time had described as Pearl Grey. This unusual feminine name caused much taunting and embarrassment in Pearl Zane Grey's childhood. The name Zane was his mother Alice's maiden name. Both of Zane's parents came from a background in farming. Alice's father farmed land in Zanesville, Ohio, a town named after her family, while Zane's father, Lewis Grey, was from Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. Alice and Lewis also had relatives that farmed in each of their respective towns, and Alice and Lewis likely met when Alice visited her sister in Westmoreland. After marriage, Lewis hated farming so much that he quit to become a dentist, relocating to Zanesville and opening an office on Main Street. Their children were Ellsworth, Ida, Ella, who died as a toddler, our author, Pearl Zane Grey, and his brother Romer, or R.C. for short. R.C. would become Zane's closest friend. Zane grew up living at 303 Converse Avenue. His father, Lewis, was a stern man who believed in temperance, morality, and religion, which he tried to impress on the young, resentful Zane. Zane had a troubled upbringing. He enjoyed an affluent life in a middle-class neighborhood, though it was necessary for him to attend the 8th Ward school with the working-class children. These working-class boys refused to accept him, a friction made worse by Zane's enthusiasm for baseball. Zane was a loner who strove to outdo his opponents both on the field and off, which left him misunderstood, unappreciated, and the object of jealousy. He got in fights, threw punches, and cast stones. He so enraged one adversary that the boy returned with a rifle intent on shooting Zane. Lewis responded to Zane's delinquency with an apple switch and abusive beatings. Lewis further antagonized Zane with a demanding work ethic, forcing him to clean the office, mow the yard, and work as a shoe salesman. During Lewis's Sunday naps, he would force Zane to fan him to sleep and punish Zane when he slipped away. One time, Lewis invaded Zane's hideout, threw a story he had written into a campfire, and beat him senseless. Another time, Zane was so angry from a whack with a willow stick that he fled up a 75-foot tree. When Lewis threatened a worse beating, Zane bounced furiously on a large limb until it cracked, terrifying the both of them. Contrary to Lewis, Zane's mother, Alice, had soft dove eyes, a gentle smile, and was nurturing and supportive of Zane. However, she warned him to stay away from the fishing stream because of a local bum who hung out there called Muddy Miser. Naturally, as a fellow outcast, Zane was inclined to befriend him. Zane's description of first seeing Muddy Miser was both poetic and mythic. I was amazed to look up and see the strange figure of a man standing way out there where the water poured over the long fall. He stood up to his bare knees in the current that foamed around his legs. He was an old man, gaunt and bowed, and he pointed a long pole out over the swift water. Whenever the boys from a wealthier class would taunt Muddy Miser for his poverty and hurl rocks at him, Zane would impulsively rush to Muddy's defense, one time getting into the most violent fight of his youth. Muddy was world-weary, mild, and soft-spoken. He mentored Zane in fishing, encouraged his writing, and got Zane to acknowledge his animosity toward work, dentistry, and his father. At the age of 14, Zane grew fascinated with the opposite sex. One of his first parties involved a parlor game in which a girl with a pillow selected a boy from the circle. The girl would drop her pillow before him, kneel upon it, and receive a kiss. To Zane, these kisses were uplifting, upsetting, and momentous. After accepting a kiss from one girl, everyone laughed so hard he fled home early. On another occasion at a party, he took a girl named Maud for a walk in the woods. She held his timid hand and accepted his further advances. But his transport over the experience ended when he learned that Maud was a flirt who acted the same way with all the boys. Muddy Miser counseled Zane that he could either support the noble ideal of womanhood or turn women into a great evil. Unfortunately, Zane's smoldering desires made Muddy's advice hard to follow. Zane's contemptible weakness for girls made kissing both shameful and irresistible. He joined a dancing club and quickly became one of the best dancers. Nellie, one of his girlfriends there, had a jealous brother named Ralph. Ralph circulated lies about Zane to get him expelled. Outraged at the injustice, Zane gave Ralph a thrashing and explained to Nellie that he cared terribly about her. Nellie was unmoved. In one incident, Zane and his friends went to a brothel and were arrested in a police raid. He recounts that he did not bed any of the women and that his wayward desires were instinctive and natural. Shortly thereafter, Lewis ran into money trouble. Lewis had either lost a large sum of money or was cheated out of a large sum of money on a trip to Washington, D.C. Zane's sister Ida claimed he was conned by some woman who fleeced him. Whatever happened, Lewis was compelled to sell his land, leave Zanesville, and move the family to Columbus, Ohio, where he changed the spelling of his last name from Gray to Grey. At the age of 17, Zane cried as he left his hometown of Zanesville, parting from Muddy Miser and the places he loved, Licking Creek, Joe's Run, and Dillon Falls, now feeling more outcast than ever. In Columbus, Zane continued assisting his father with tooth extractions at his fledgling new dental practice. Zane had developed a powerful grip from baseball and fishing that proved valuable. One time, an elderly woman requested that Lewis drive out to Frazeysburg for an extraction and assured him of additional business. Hesitant, though desperate, Lewis sent his boy Zane. When Zane arrived, he learned that the patient wanted all of her teeth removed. Scared, though resilient, he administered enough cocaine to make her gums white. Finally, he groped his forceps, went for a promising nub, and with a silent prayer, yanked. Hard. When the first tooth came out cleanly, and his patient felt nothing, he proceeded to extract the remaining 26 without breaking one. His success impressed locals so much they invited him back, which turned into once-a-week visits to Frazeysburg and surrounding towns. On a visit to Warsaw, Zane's first customer requested that he extract his only tooth. The tooth was enormous, felt like a solid nail in hard oak. When Zane gave it a powerful twist and vigorous pull, there came a sound like a pistol shot, and the forceps were knocked out of his hands. Sooner or later, an official from the Ohio State Dental Association contacted Lewis and explained that no action would be taken if the young man would stop practicing or enter a qualified program. Lacking money for education, Zane turned more focus onto baseball. What began with pickup games at the Madden Hill Playground in Zanesville evolved into joining the Capitals, a strong team in the semi-professional City League of Columbus, who became league champions the same year. On one occasion, Zane started throwing curveballs to strike out the batters. Before reaching victory, however, the umpire declared him a ringer, and Zane took off running into the cornfield. His team, a presumptuous group of amateurs with no college affiliation, was able to schedule a game with the Ohio State team, and won by a lopsided score. At the age of 21, Zane applied to Penn for dentistry, something he needed more than wanted. It was his athletic prowess and Penn's desire for winning teams that got him accepted. Unlike today's ball players, he did not arrive with a guaranteed commitment from either Penn or its team. His scholarship was contingent upon his performance at tryout. The game was against a Riverton club of college graduates that had beaten Penn's varsity team the year before. At the end of the fifth inning, Penn was down 4-2. Grey was tapped to pitch. This choice dismayed the veterans, who did not want a greenhorn ruining their chance at victory. With great speed, perfect control, and a wonderful curveball, Grey held Riverton hitless for 3 innings. After his team tied the score and sent the game into a 10th, Grey yielded a hit, but not a score. When Penn came to bat, he rapped a double and scored a winning run. His performance earned him acceptance at Penn and exemption from the dental school's entrance exams. At Penn, Grey slacked off to the point he had to contact his professors for passing grades in order to continue playing on the team. They saw him as a victim of circumstance and a promising athlete. They gave him a pass freshman year. During the summer break, Zane played for local Ohio teams and was arrested in Columbus on a paternity charge filed by a girl from Delphos. Zane and Lewis quickly traveled to Delphos and settled with the girl for $100. Zane played the summer nines for sophomore and junior years as well. In January 1896, when the athletic committee at Penn ruled that all students who participated in summer baseball would be ineligible to play for the school, they banished all the returning members of the 1895 team except Grey and another player. Grey had the foresight to modify his name during the summer games to escape punishment. Later in 1896, Zane graduated from Penn's School of Dentistry. For the following 2 years, he played baseball for the Orange Athletic Club in Orange, New Jersey. Near the end of his stint, he moved to New York City and opened a cramped office at 117 West 21st Street. This was an impoverished area and filled with immigrants who came to him with acute dental problems and little money. Rarely going outside, Zane kept to his bleak office and became an avid reader. He turned to women to alleviate his isolation. One was a young seamstress named Doris from an equally troubled childhood. Despite her company, he badly needed a break from bad teeth, foul breath, and 6-day work weeks. In 1899, he and his brother R.C. traveled to Lackawaxen, a popular summer spot near the upper Delaware River. There, he discovered that fishing and camping rejuvenated him. Upon return to New York, he moved his office to 100 West 74th Street for more room and better patients. He dropped the name Pearl and became Dr. Zane Grey. The following year, in 1900, while at West Colong Railroad Station near Lackawaxen, he encountered an attractive young woman leaving the train. He sparked a conversation and learned that the buxom, brown-eyed girl called herself Dolly. Her full name was Lena Elise Roth, and her warm response to his overtures began their lifelong relationship. Dolly was 17, 11 years Zane's junior, and had finished her freshman year at New York Normal College, later named Hunter College, where she was preparing to become an elementary school teacher. She weighed 122 pounds, was 5'4", had an ebullient temperament, and an outgoing personality. She came from a family of doctors. She and her widowed mother were about to move into a stately residence at 701 St. Nicholas. A series of family deaths had ensured her a comfortable existence. During a stroll the day after their meeting, Zane boldly kissed Dolly. Since she had to leave a few days later, there was little time for more kisses, but they continued to meet and correspond when Zane returned to New York, and their relationship quickly developed. Her letter started out, "Dear Dr. Grey," and evolved to "Dear Pearl," and then switched to "Doc," all within a 3-month time span. Although he was happy with Dolly, he did not let go of his other girlfriends. In 1901, on a trip to Columbus, Zane's conversation with his mother rekindled fond memories of the stories about his ancestors and of how he'd read about them in a book called Our Western Border, published in 1879. It was his epiphany that transformed the has-been ball player and unhappy dentist into a writer. In his youth, he was a poor English student, a fact that made him self-conscious. To build up his confidence, he read many of the writing guides of the day, such as John H. Gardner's The Forms of Prose Literature, published in 1900, and Herbert Spencer's Philosophy of Style, 1873. Zane also had Dolly. Dolly had taken many English courses, knew the fundamentals, and encouraged him to continue. Her discussions of writing were often naive, but the important thing for Zane's career was her reassurance. By writing every moment he could spare over the fall and winter of 1902 and 1903, he had 2 articles published by the magazine Recreation, and he wrote his first novel, Betty Zane. He sent out the manuscript from Betty Zane to demoralizing rejections. Ultimately, the book was funded by R.C.'s fiancée and soon-to-be wife, Reba Smith. Her family owned coal mines in Blairsville, Pennsylvania, and the trust was so large that Zane's brother R.C. never had to work again a day in his life. The novel depicts Zane's ancestors as resourceful pioneers who battled Indians and cleared the way for settlement. Although the characters were not well-rounded on a personal note, writing the book showed Zane that he was imagining lives more adventurous than his own. As for Dolly, who likely influenced the character Betty, she went from being an awed admirer to demanding more of Zane's attention. Zane was impressed by her love of canoeing, fishing, and camping in Lackawaxen. In contrast, her family's estimate of Zane was of a poor provider, an unworthy suitor, notwithstanding the relationship itself. Zane's turbulent emotions provoked conflict that worried and sometimes frightened Dolly. Zane also did not conceal his other girlfriends, and found it easier to apologize for his behavior than to change it. To encourage intimacy, Dolly would pressure him to reveal his true feelings and reassure him of her trust. Not only did Zane grapple with relationships, but also his profession. His father suggested that he remain with dentistry and write on the side. When Zane looked at his father's current lifestyle, however, he saw only an impoverished and deranged man whose dark moods drove away the last of his patience and made his family miserable. In regard to writing as a profession, Zane crossed the Rubicon. He bought a house on 3 acres of land at the confluence of the Delaware and Lackawaxen rivers for himself, his mother, and his sister in 1904, liberating himself from New York City, whereby he focused on 2 manuscripts, Shores of the Lethe, a critique of contemporary thinking, and Peaceable Village, a sequel to Betty Zane. Betty Zane had not yet recovered its publishing cost. In spite of his drop in job status from okay dentist to struggling writer at age 32, Zane continued to resist marriage. Dolly, though understandably jealous, was nurturing and willing to go against her family's wishes to marry into his. On July 15, 1905, Lewis Gray was overcome by heat and taken to Mount Carmel Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. 6 days later, he died of heart failure. His death shattered Zane's resistance to marriage. Without his father looming over Zane's decision, at least in his mind's eye, on November 21, 1905, Zane and Dolly were wed. For their honeymoon, Dolly wanted a cross-country trip and was willing to pay for it. Zane, who so badly wanted to travel, was reluctant to leave home. Nonetheless, they went to the Grand Canyon, where Zane was captivated by the vast, desolate scenery, where he dreamed of exploring and camping in the shadowy recesses below, little realizing that his writings would one day influence the way visitors perceived this landscape. In San Diego, Zane caught a shark from a nearby pier, the beginning of his life of sea fishing. The couple also passed through Altadena, California, and stayed at Catalina Island, a huge fishing destination for catching large tuna. In February, however, the sport was out of season. Zane's guidebooks on writing stressed the importance of personal experience, and combined with his ancestors' adventures in Ohio, thrust him into writing fishing articles, including some on tarpon fishing from a second trip he took to Tampico, Mexico in 1907. But to Zane, fishing could not make a novel. On a return trip to the Grand Canyon at the age of 35, he was seen as a tenderfoot from the East and enlisted the help of C.T. Buffalo Jones, a semi-famous 63-year-old outdoorsman. Zane also recruited Jim Emmett, a prominent and controversial local, and Jim Owens, Yellowstone's game warden. Together with several Mormon elders, they departed from Flagstaff for Lee's Ferry by horse. The ride left Zane stiff and sore, with cracked lips, swollen tongue, burning eyes, and terrified of treacherous drops. On a positive note, he was intrigued by Mr. Emmett, who came from Mormon parents and had settled in Utah. Emmett was a polygamist with 2 wives and 20 children. When Emmett's first wife was 38, he married another woman who was 18. Emmett slept out in the open most nights and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the area. When Zane returned to Lackawaxen, he worked feverishly developing his notes into the novel The Last of the Plainsmen. Critical indifference to the first 2 books had strained his commitment to writing. His new literary agent, who Zane had arranged, told him to damn the critics. Zane tried not to care, but he did, falling into deep depression over the work. Harper and Brothers rejected it to the point Zane did not register the full impact until he reached the street and suddenly had to grip a lamppost to keep from falling. The novel was placed with Outing Publishing, a press known for its sport magazine with the same name. It gained Grey a reputation among sportsmen as a daring and accomplished traveler. Eltridge Warner, at Field and Stream, a magazine that began in 1898, thought so too, publishing 3 of Grey's articles and promoting him and his new book. This was followed by more trips to the Grand Canyon for mountain lion hunting and an exploration that took him through an inaccessible trail overlooking Surprise Valley and Thunder River. By summer 1909, Outing had financially collapsed, failing to pay Zane for 5,000 copies of Plainsmen. The loss left Zane dispirited. The birth of his son Romer that fall, however, spurred him to resume his writing with a crazed determination. By January 1910, he completed his first Western, the genre Zane Grey is known for today. The Heritage of the Desert introduced the reader to a 24-year-old Easterner named John Heer, who has journeyed to Salt Lake City to recover from a vaguely defined ailment. He finds therapeutic redemption in the desert's barren climate and meets an Indian named Mescal, meaning desert flower, who introduces him to the spirit of their surrounding environment, which intensifies their romance and completes his recovery. Their trouble is not over, for Mescal is set to marry a Mormon, the villain of the story. For many of Grey's novels, the protagonist was commonly affected with an illness contracted by forces in the East, derived from industrialization, urbanization, and commercialism, whereby the character moves west into nature for its therapy and healing properties. Unfortunately, Zane stood in stark contrast to this concept. He wrote, "I'm haunted by a yearning to go afar, into the wilds mostly, and yet I know that when I do go, I never find content. Then I long for my home, my books, my family. It is a strange thing, this unrest, this insatiate desire to find the place and the happiness that seem forever just beyond the horizon. But they never are. They are in the depths of my soul, and I never yet mined that deep." By 1910, Popular magazine paid $1,800 for rights to serialize Heritage of the Desert. With the money, Zane rented a large house in Atlantic City for Dolly and his mother and sister at 103 Albion Place. Then Zane and his brother traveled to Long Key, an island in the Florida Keys. Zane's excursions soon found him in desolate northeastern Arizona heading toward Kayenta. These impressive landscapes followed Zane back to Lackawaxen and into his most well-known novel, Riders of the Purple Sage, published in 1912. He had originally vowed not to roast the peace-loving Mormons, then changed his mind. The novel opens with the protagonist, Jane Witherstein, inheriting a large ranch in a surrounding area controlled by Mormons. They oppose outsiders and support Elder Tull's wish to marry her and add her to his collection of wives. In the meantime, Jane befriends an impoverished outcast named Venters. The pair are soon cornered by a band of Mormon gunmen. Tull is about to horsewhip Venters when a leather-clad stranger rides up and politely asks Jane to water his horse. Tull proclaims that the stranger is meddling in Mormon law, to which the stranger replies, "To hell with your Mormon law." The stranger's name is Lassiter, a legendary gunfighter. When the Mormons try to leave with Venters, Lassiter is beseeched by Jane to help, and he refuses to let them take him. Venters stays. This powerful scene was energized by Gray's personal life. The Mormons who lectured Jane and threatened Venters echo Zane's in-laws, who likewise judge Zane to be an outsider, unworthy of Dolly, and a threat to the wealth and position that Dolly's dead father had bequeathed her. Lassiter, on the other hand, embodies Zane's lower-class status, athleticism, and outdoorsmanship. When Zane submitted Riders to Harper's, the editor, Ripley Hitchcock, swiftly rejected it, as he did Plainsman before. This time, Zane did not accept this judgment. He used his agent to appeal to Hitchcock's superior, Frederick Danica, by sending the manuscript to Danica's wife. The appeal worked. She loved it. Danica told Hitchcock to reverse his decision. Hitchcock obeyed, citing that, "I really did not lay sufficient stress on my appreciation, and my conscience reproaches me for having possibly been too critical." As for magazine work, Field and Stream broke its policy on publishing fiction and bought the rights to serialize. With the proceeds, Zane leased an apartment at 550 West 157th Street to be near good medical help for Dolly's second child. Despite negative reviews, Riders of the Purple Sage was the first of Gray's books to make the bestseller list. In April 1912, Dolly gave birth to a daughter named Betty. The child was healthy, but Dolly had developed phlebitis, and doctors worried about blood clots and a possible stroke. She took months to recover, during which time Zane was at work on his next book, The Light of Western Stars, published in 1914. The story features Madeline Hammond, a young woman who hails from an Eastern family of privilege. Unlike the males of previous books, she's not ill but tired of fashionable society and wants more from life. She heads to New Mexico, falls in love with the land, and buys a ranch. A suitor comes from the east to woo her, but she is soon caught up with a lower-class cowboy. She tames the wild cowboy to a point he becomes nonviolent and unable to defend himself. Considered now a trope, Zane Grey created a cornerstone convention of the Western, that a man grows weak and ineffectual when he commits himself to one woman and that woman's expectations. While writing this novel, a glamorous approximation of the character Madeline entered Zane's life. Her name was Lillian Wilhelm, Dolly's cousin, whom he got to know in New York. Over the summer in Lackawaxen, Zane invited Lillian and another of Dolly's cousins, Elma Schwartz, to visit. Dolly was eerily reluctant to acknowledge the threat these women posed. Several months later, in February 1913, Zane took Lillian and Elma with him to Long Key and then to Arizona, where they found themselves at a trading post on the western edge of Monument Valley, bound for an enormous natural arch called Nonnezoshe by the Navajos, better known today as Rainbow Bridge. Zane writes, "It absolutely silenced me. My body and brain, weary and dull from the toil of travel, received a singular and reviving freshness. I had a strange, mystic perception that this rosy-hued, tremendous arch of stone was a goal I had failed to reach in some former life, but had now found. Here was a rainbow magnified even beyond dreams, a thing not transparent and ethereal, but solidified. A work of ages, sweeping up majestically from the red walls, its iris-hued arch against the blue sky." The people Zane met on this journey materialized in his next novel, The Rainbow Trail, published 1915, including John Wetherill, the trading post owner, and Nasha Bengay, a Navajo guide who led expeditions to see the bridge. The villains were the Mormon polygamists. Given his ongoing involvement with Lillian and now her sister Claire, it's amazing Zane wasn't more sympathetic toward Mormons. Perhaps it indicates the struggle within himself, as the romances of the heroes in his novels remain wholesome. Back in New York, Dolly buried the pain of betrayal and concluded the city was a poor place to raise children. she broke their lease and bought an imposing residence at 101 South Street in Middletown, New York, a town where R.C. and Reba already lived. In 1914, Zane sold the film rights to Western Stars for $500 to a producer named William Selig. Selig fully intended to shoot the film, but his company prevented it. Zane's agent in these matters, Robert Davis, scolded Zane for being a rotten businessman and advised him not to handle sales negotiations in the future. Zane thought about starting a film company of his own, but turbulence in this fledgling industry was intimidating. An entrepreneur, Benjamin Hampton, proposed an alternative. Grey would retain film rights, participate in the process, and share the profits, and still have ample time for travel and writing. Before this, Zane had resorted to selling his film rights. Prior to this, The Border Legion was released by Goldwyn, Riders, and Rainbow by Fox. Retaining film rights seemed the best bet. Zane accepted Hampton's deal, releasing films under the name Zane Grey Pictures. Desert Gold opened in 1919. It was shot in Palm Springs, California, far from the Arizona-Mexico border that Zane had advocated, but he praised the film regardless. He also praised Hampton's elimination of the star system. Hampton's lack of stars wasn't an artistic choice, but due to his lack of budget. The motive eluded Zane, probably for the best. In Zane's world, there was only room for one star, Zane Grey. His aversion to famous actors stemmed from a fishing trip he had once taken with the Farnham brothers to Catalina. He'd written an article intended to be humorous where a marlin makes off with actor Dustin Farnham's equipment. The stunt made Dustin look like a buffoon, even though he'd landed a 322-pound broad bill later that season. In any event, Zane's involvement in the film industry had influenced his novels. Pressed by Davis to think in terms of stage and film, Zane increased the dialogue and action sequences in his books. Chases, stampedes, shootouts, and above all, kissing scenes. An example of this was The Lone Star Ranger, published 1915, and the first novel, to Zane's surprise, to reach #1 on the Bookman monthly list. Grey injected even more Perils of Pauline and Jim Dandy to the Rescue type scenes into The UP Trail, published 1918. Zane was also a seasoned fisherman, though he did not begin that way. In 1915, he and Robert Davis, with several others, went fishing out of Seabright, New Jersey. After no success, they spotted a school of porpoises and decided to strike one with a harpoon attached to a line from Grey's rod and reel. For a solid hour, Zane reeled the porpoise to the boat while the porpoise kept towing their dory out to sea. When the fish eventually surfaced, one of the men shot it. The wounded porpoise erupted into a palsied frenzy and went limp. Zane, exhausted, reeled it to the boat, where the porpoise suddenly revived and thrashed violently. More gunshots and a massive hemorrhage finally killed the fish and allowed Zane to prevail. Published as a novelty article by Davis, their flagrancy challenged the Tuna Club's strict rules. Had the porpoise been shot in Catalina, where the Tuna Club reigned, they would have been disqualified and censured. Zane quietly sided with the pranksters, then struck out on his own to catch saltwater fish the acceptable way, with a 24-strand line. His fishing exploits carried him from Long Key, Florida, to Tampico, Mexico, to Catalina Island, California. He hired boat captains with state-of-the-art equipment and invested in high-quality rods and reels that landed him big tuna, swordfish, marlin, amberjacks, barracudas, and great whites. Early Tuna Club members fished from boats that resembled Seabright dories and evolved into 18 to 20-foot launches with 10-horsepower motors situated midship that boatmen used to maneuver the craft and assist the angler seated on the rear of the boat. Blue buttons were awarded for tuna caught that weighed over 100 pounds. For tuna caught over 200 pounds, anglers would receive a gold button. In 1916, Zane commissioned his own boat, a 26-foot launch, a decision that created money squabbles in his marriage. Dolly wanted to buy more property in Lackawaxen and renovate the main house. To accomplish this, she went to Harper's for an advance to cover cost. Nevertheless, by 1917, the Betty Zane made its maiden voyage at Long Key. The result was disastrous. The boat rocked too much and the engine seized from a cracked piston. It was a costly lesson. To Dolly and Zane, bickering over money, however, was symptomatic of deeper problems. Since his trip to Rainbow Bridge with Lillian and Elma, Zane had steadily added to his coterie. A girl named Pauly Hunter and Lillian's sister Claire, and Dolly's secretaries Mildred Ferguson and Mildred Smith, as well as a girl Zane had met at a local dance, Dorothy Ackerman. In 1917, the maid, Emmeline, brought Dolly a journal describing her relationship with Zane. Dolly sent Zane a letter calmly berating him. Dolly kept remarkably cool for being the mother of his 3 children. She had given birth to her 3rd child, another son, in 1915 named Lauren. It was becoming harder and harder for Dolly to remain detached. Meanwhile, Zane grew tormented over America entering World War I. To him, the young men who rushed to enlist were fools, heading senselessly toward death. He disliked politics, but became embroiled himself. During research for a Western, he was attracted to problems with the wheat industry and the activities of the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, also known as the Wobblies. Zane found them a serious threat to wheat production and cast them as villains in The Desert of Wheat, published in 1919. The novel is set in the present time and addressed the war's damage to the homeland culture and beliefs. On a trip to San Francisco with Dolly, Mildred, and Dorothy, Zane received news that his mother, Alice, had died in Lackawaxen. Her death was unexpected and upsetting. He advised R.C. to hold the funeral without him. Dolly, Mildred, and Dorothy returned to Lackawaxen. Zane continued to L.A. to meet up with Claire, Lillian, and Elma, and took the next ferry with them to Catalina. The fishing was sensational. Zane hooked and landed his first broadbill, 260 pounds. Between Long Key and Catalina, fractures showed within Zane's retinue. He'd originally favored Lillian most, then her sister Claire, and then Dorothy. Claire mentions an unpleasant incident that left her despondent. Zane had presented Dorothy with a diamond ring for her birthday. To remedy this, Lillian intervened on her sister Claire's behalf for Zane to consider her feelings. Recommitted to the Western, Zane decided his next story would center on a long desert trek. For real-life inspiration, he recruited a raw-boned Norwegian adventurer named Sivert Nielsen. Next, Zane assembled the mules and left from Altadena in March 1919. At Death Valley Junction, they loaded supplies and went for a relatively uneventful 4-day outing into the area of Furnace Creek and the Panamint Mountains. 2 more months of hard work and bipolar mood swings enabled Zane to finish his new book at midnight on May 29th, titled Wanderer of the Wasteland, published in 1923. The novel is one of Gray's finest westerns. Using words the way an impressionist dabs his oils, he serves up a masterly portrait of the most unhospitable environment in the Southwest while channeling his personal life into the main character. By 1920, the 47-year-old was on top and in charge. After struggling with rejection and disappointment for the first 10 years of his writing career, and then capitalizing on his hard-won advances during World War I, he now experienced a clamoring demand for anything he wrote. He received $15,000 for Wanderer and $10,000 for serialization. When his contract for Harper's was up, they renewed it for the largest sum ever put forth to an American author. In 1916, Zane's annual income was $27,000. By 1919, it reached $95,000. For 1920, he earned $178,000, and for 1922 and 1923 combined, his income exceeded $500,000. He bought a house in Altadena to be closer to Catalina Island. While Dolly procured the furnishings, Zane left on a trip with his brother R.C., his brother's wife Reba, Sivert Nielsen, and Claire, Elma, and Dorothy. This time they went to the Mogollon Rim, which overlooked the Tato Basin of east-central Arizona. Zane purchased several rifles, shipped out his horse, Don Carlos, and hired George Takahashi, a chef who would remain with Gray for 15 years. Zane arranged for 3 wagons of supplies, 21 horses, and a party of 12 people. They hunted turkey, deer, lynx, mountain lion, and bear. The elaborate planning eliminated the hardships of his earlier trips. The inclusion of the girls also kept spirits high. When the temperature dropped below zero and ice crystals had formed on their blankets, Claire expressed dauntless enthusiasm for the glorious and beautiful morning. During 1921, Grey fell in love with Louise Anderson. It was his affair with this teenager that toppled the quixotic balance of his life and sorely strained his marriage. They likely met somewhere in New York, according to Zane. The girl seemed a creature born of my imagination, a composite of my characters, yet infinitely stronger and sweeter and closer to me than all of them. He brought her to an upcoming celebration in Zanesville, Ohio, where he stayed with the Anderson family. Mrs. Anderson was the girl, Nellie Dennis, who rejected Zane in youth, the girl he cared terribly for and he beat up her brother Ralph over. Nellie deployed considerable charm to rekindle Zane's adolescent feelings. When this failed, Nellie conspired to get Zane together with her attractive daughter. After Zanesville, Zane insisted on traveling with Louise back to Altadena. Dorothy, now dethroned from her place in the sun, was furious. Louise was given the nickname Calamity. Everywhere she went, Long Key, Avalon, Rainbow Bridge, Louise provoked a widening rift between Zane and Dolly. Husband and wife were no longer intimate, and Dolly feared their much-tested marriage would come to an end. The 39-year-old Dolly writes, "I'd climbed a long way up the hill to peace and happiness between us. But this thing caused me to take a tumble that hurt pretty bad, and it was some time before I could gather myself together to start climbing again. In my fury and resentment, I want to go tobogganing clear down to hell." By 1923, she had spiraled into depression and departed for a summer tour of Europe. Zane remarked, "I fear my old Penelope is at last finding me not worth writing to or loving me anymore." Rifts continued to grow. Up to this point, Zane's paramours were only Dolly's relatives and kindred spirits. Louise was an outsider. Their bond left the group feeling alienated, unappreciated, and resentful. Some went on to get married, others just left. Zane enlisted Dolly to mend the rift between him and Dorothy to no avail. His state of mind generated corrosive doubts about his ability to sustain his literary success and the writing schedule required by his contracts. In 1921, he published The Call of the Canyon. The novel was geared toward readers of the Ladies' Home Journal as part of the contract he had worked out with his editor, Barton Curry. The story features Carly Birch, a wealthy young New Yorker who enjoys the life of a typical flapper. When her fiancé, Glenn, returns from the war troubled and wounded, he is so upset by Carly that he flees west. There, Glenn meets Flo Hunter, who provides him with the genre's conventional therapeutic healing. When Carly follows Glenn to the west, she awakens to the error of her Eastern ways and goes on diatribes about flappers, women like her former self. In 1922, Zane published The Day of the Beast against Dolly's warnings and Harper's. The novel is another social commentary that condemns the promiscuity of young women in the jazz age at large. Reviews were brutal. Was Zane being hypocritical? Maybe. Ashamed of some aspects of his moral character? Possibly. On the fishing front, Zane bought a new powerboat, this time with a 53-foot hull. 17 grand later, the boat Gladiator arrived in Catalina. The same year, 1921, a Mrs. Keith Spaulding landed a 426-pound broadbill. Although not a member of the Tuna Club, as women were not admitted, Mr. Keith Spaulding was. So when Zane made the claim that she only caught the fish because of her boatman's expert maneuvering, the Tuna Club demanded Zane's censure, an ordeal that culminated in his resignation. By now, Zane's time with Louise had run its course. While she cut ties with Zane, he cut ties with producer Benjamin Hampton, when Zane realized he could make more money from selling film rights than from Hampton's films. The honor of adapting Grey's novels went to producer Jesse Lasky, who agreed to film The Call of the Canyon, The Vanishing American, and The Heritage of the Desert in the settings that inspired them. When Dolly returned from Europe, Dorothy had filled her in on Zane's dalliances, and she gave him a chilly reception. Desperate to escape the whirlwind of his destructive emotions, he celebrated Christmas a day early and left for New York alone. Zane was America's most popular author, but feared himself lurching toward his father's embittered isolation. To add to his problems, in 1924, Zane mailed the Catalina Islander an article that denounced the Tuna Club's standard 24-thread line. A melodrama ensued in print. The fallout, however, did not wound Zane as much as the events of the preceding year. Zane wrote Dolly, "I miss you like hell. Something is wrong with me." Dolly, choosing to reciprocate, sent Zane a letter that facilitated his recovery. With renewed vigor, Zane set off for Nova Scotia. Tuna there were reported to be 4 times the size of Catalina's, and nobody cared how many threads you used. To offset his isolation, Zane brought his son Romer, his brother R.C., Lillian, Lillian's husband, and Mildred to accompany him. The August weather was rainy, foggy, and cool. The fishing was poor at first. After a draining 6-hour fight, Zane landed a 684-pound tuna. 7 days later, he landed a 758-pound tuna and earned himself a world record. Outside the Tuna Club's jurisdiction, the Islander ran only a brief notice of the catch. Zane countered their indifference with aggressive promotion through Field and Stream, Bookman, and the American Magazine. This catch encouraged Zane to grow even more ambitious. He purchased a 185-foot-long, 35-foot-wide, 3-masted sailing schooner called Marshall Folk and set his sights on the Pacific. He outfitted the boat with 2 Fairbanks Morse engines, an electric generator for lights and fans, an air compressor to drain water, and an emergency engine. Below decks, he created 8 staterooms, 4 bathrooms, a large refrigerated storeroom, a dark room, and storage for tackle. He also built a saloon and dining area large enough to accommodate mountings of his 2 huge tunas on opposite walls. He named the boat Fisherman and set out for the Galapagos Islands. Joining him were Claire, Lillian, her husband, Mildred, George the cook, a professional cameraman from Lasky Studios, Zane's son Romer, and Romer's friend Johnny Shields. Romer was 15 years old and had been exhibiting a headstrong, rebellious behavior that worried Zane. With festering guilt, Zane speculated that his absence may have contributed to Romer's waywardness and decided to include him on the outings, in spite of Romer missing most of his junior year in high school. The lush vegetation of Cocos and Perlas Islands, their cascading waves of flowers, and the erupting flocks of birds impressed Zane as truly exotic. The fishing, though, was disappointing. Whenever Zane hooked a large fish, the sharks would swarm and devour it. They caught a dolphin out of novelty, then decided to catch only sharks. They caught 3, which was sweaty, grueling work. Afterward, they stopped in Zihuatanejo, Mexico, and met the villagers. When they dropped anchor off the coast of Cabo San Lucas, they happened upon the most spectacular fishing of their voyage. By day 2, they'd caught 31 tunas. At the end of their trip, after their arrival in L.A., Claire, Lillian, and her husband bid Zane farewell and parted ways for the last time. To his credit, Zane understood that the real achievement of this trip was the experience, not the fishing or 3 world records. He had dared to journey far away from a culture he perceived as unreceptive to his values and beliefs. He had extended his range, reached the truly remote, and was now ready for somewhere even further. In 1925, his novel The Thundering Herd was a return to form. To maximize book sales, Zane and Lasky had timed his novels to be released 2 months before each movie tie-in. Also, Publishers Weekly ran an article listing the 100 best-selling authors from 1900 through 1924. Zane Grey ranked number 6, and while the magazine was at it, they promoted Thundering Herd. Lasky allotted big budgets for Herd and The Vanishing American. He remade The Light of Western Stars, Desert Gold, and Man of the Forest. the originals being from Hampton's production house. Then Lasky filmed the serials The Code of the West, Wild Horse Mesa, and Drums of the Desert. The appetite audiences had for these films was so insatiable that Fox capitalized on the rights it had bought from Grey years before and remade The Last of the Duans, Rainbow Trail, and Riders of the Purple Sage, with actor Tom Mix in the lead role. Criticism on Grey's novels increased, but had so little effect that one critic decided to crystallize the real reason for Grey's success. The critic's name was T.K. Whipple, a professor at the University of California. He claimed that Grey's westerns are American folk tales and the modern versions of Icelandic sagas like Beowulf. Ironically, Whipple thought Zane was too simple and naive when it came to sex. He took Harper's promotional material at face value, that Zane was a straight-laced family man. Bookman's John Farrar had weighed in, as did the wit and personality of the 20s, Heywood Broun. Grey stayed out of this literary debate and Algonquin roundtable nonsense. He was too busy having his tonsils removed while fighting a cold after a trip to South America. Undeterred, he planned the next getaway, Oregon. The destination was Rogue River. The appeal of this adventure for Zane lay in arranging an appropriate boat to each of the upper stretches with the rocks and rapids. He showed up with 4 boats, 23-footers with upraised bows and sterns, and flared gunnels, prototypes of the drift boats we see on western rivers today. The 10 miles and 17 rapids the group covered were emotional for Zane. The gentle water at the start allowed him to savor the magnificent beauty of the heavily timbered, mountainous terrain, but the narrowing canyon walls eventually funneled the boats into rapids so treacherous that he had to turn the steering over to the guide to run his boat through one stretch. Later, Zane lost control through an easier length and grounded his boat midstream on a rock. By the time he arrived at the campsite, he was bruised, starved, and exhausted. While Zane was away, Dolly had learned that he sold his cereal to McCall's without informing her. During the Galapagos voyage, he'd helped Mildred Smith with a novel entitled Desert Bound. Mildred became so despondent over her repeated rejections that Zane placed the novel under his name. He first went to Ladies' Home Journal, but after a slow response, he sold it to McCall's. The problem was that Zane's loyalty to Ladies' Home Journal was paramount. This betrayal ended future business, but Zane pressed on. His next trip, New Zealand. On December 29, 1925, Zane, Mildred, Zane's guide Mitchell, and 3 truckloads of gear left L.A. for San Fran, where they boarded the SS Makura for a voyage that took 26 days and covered 7,000 miles. After commissioning several local boatmen, he equipped the launches with his own fighting chairs and fishing tackle. Over his next 3 months in the Bay of Islands in New Zealand, Zane had the best fishing of his life. He caught a 111-pound yellowtail, a 400-pound broadbill, a 450-pound striped marlin, a 704-pound black marlin, and 17 mako sharks. Before his return to Auckland, where large celebrations were scheduled to honor him, local newspapers had devoted extensive coverage to his new world records and offered displayed photographs of his catches. For greater promotion, Zane contacted the Natural History Museum in New York after hearing they were planning a haul of fishes and donated as many specimens as he could. His next trip, Tahiti. The fishing, disappointing. Although he caught no additional specimens for the exhibit, his large collection validated him as the country's most accomplished saltwater fisherman. In addition to boats and gear, another expense was a new house in Altadena that Zane financed for Mildred. Over the many years of typing and editing his manuscripts, Mildred harbored intense longings to be a writer too. This close interaction made Mildred more critical of Zane's work and less sure of her own. Clearly, Mildred's secretarial wages were inadequate for mortgage payments. To no one's surprise, Zane assumed her debt. But either due to arguments or his unshakable commitment to Dolly, Zane and Mildred parted ways. Later, Mildred blackmailed him with their love letters in order to keep the house. In October 1929, the stock market crashed. Zane's earnings for the year were $340,000. Thinking the economic decline was temporary, he scheduled another trip to Tahiti. This time, the fishing was excellent. In May 1930, he successfully hooked and landed a giant Tahitian striped marlin that weighed 1,040 pounds. During a grueling 2-hour fight, as he hauled the weary giant to the boat and his double leader reached his reel, he felt a series of jerks and realized that sharks were attacking. Furious counterattacks failed to repulse them, and the sharks devoured large chunks of the marlin's tail section, a maiming that reduced its official weight. Regardless, it was a world record catch for a striped marlin on rod and reel, bringing Zane a euphoric sense of achievement. The catch blinded Zane to the economic downturn. Dolly warned him not to purchase another boat, but he did for $300,000, a 180-foot German-made yacht called Callisto. During the boat's renovations, Zane dug in to write The Trail Driver, Thunder Mountain, and Knights of the Range. He hired Bernice Campbell as a replacement secretary. Dolly arranged for Bernice to monitor Zane's spending. By the end of 1930, the Callisto had been renamed Fisherman II, and Zane, his daughter Betty, his secretary Bernice, and photographer Bob Carney awaited the ship's arrival at Flower Point in Tahiti. Mitchell, the captain, had been overcharging Zane $450 under Mildred's watch. Under Bernice, this error was corrected. When another boatman informed Zane of Mitchell's derogatory comments, Zane fired him. Mitchell responded with a lawsuit for wrongful discharge that threatened to impound Zane's boat and block his cruise. Mildred, in the flesh, randomly appeared and offered testimony in Mitchell's defense. Zane settled with him for $2,685 and the title to his new launch, Sky Blue II, which had cost $6,500. Mitchell ended up drinking himself to death before the year was out. Finally, though, Fisherman II arrived in Tahiti and the group set sail. 3 days out of port, the ship encountered turbulent seas and rolled so much that everyone became violently ill. Like the Betty Zane before it, his yacht was a white elephant. Meanwhile, Dolly was busy juggling debt payments to publishing houses and magazines to cover the yacht's expenses. Zane returned to Altadena regretful and disappointed. Like Mildred, the secretary Bernice had writerly aspirations. She wrote a novel about her hitchhiking adventures. When Zane realized her writing was worse than Mildred's, he reworked the book and sold it for serialization to the Pictorial Review for $30,000. Bernice took the agreement to an attorney, and Dolly settled with her out of court. From here on, Dolly was in charge of business decisions. She learned accounting and bookkeeping, but in need of a secretary, Zane hired his son Romer's friend, Wanda Williams, who was of Christian Science. Over 1932 and 1933, Dolly could not place a single serialization. Magazines had been hit hard. Harper's continued to publish 1 and sometimes 2 Grey novels each year, but their profits were used to pay off Zane's debt. Given the worsening state of the economy and to avoid being taxed into oblivion, Dolly formed the company Zane Grey Incorporated. But Zane was not out of the woods yet. One of his boats, the Frangipani, docked in New Zealand, was in danger of seizure for back taxes. Scrambling, he hired a captain to smuggle the ship from New Zealand to Tahiti across 2,500 miles of open sea to escape the New Zealand authorities. The evasion was successful. Around 1933, Wanda decamped over Zane's refusal to marry her. She was soon replaced by Brunella Baker, his last secretary. Also around this time, he received fan letters from Lola Gornall, a poet living in Australia. He would send her 500 letters over the next 4 years, but upon meeting her in person, she parried his advances. In 1935, Zane's brother R.C. died. Having regarded R.C. as his closest friend since childhood, Zane was devastated and heartbroken. Dolly believed that Zane's persistent depression, lack of vitality, and diminished interest in fishing were extremely serious. In 1937, Zane suffered a stroke. He'd been fishing on the North Umpqua River. When the temperature topped 100 degrees, he opted for a nap. When he awoke, he knew something was wrong. He'd fallen asleep in the sun. Overnight, he was stricken with a second, more damaging stroke that left him unable to speak or move the right side of his body. His recovery was difficult. For months, he could not walk or write. Determined to keep working, he resorted to dictation. By early 1939, he felt well enough to return to Australia to fish. He hooked an 800-pound great white shark. Everyone aboard urged the 67-year-old fisherman to abandon the fight and not risk his fragile health. He refused. The battle left him incapacitated for weeks, but he landed the shark. In October, Grey celebrated the publication of Western Union with a book signing at Vroman's bookstore in downtown L.A. The day went smoothly, and he felt fine when he retired that evening. He fell asleep in bed with Dolly in a screened porch upstairs in their Altadena home. Early the next morning, he awoke gasping for air. When Dolly was unable to help, she contacted the family doctor and dispatched her son Lauren to bring the doctor to the house. By the time they returned, Zane was dead of a massive heart attack. Later that day, as Dolly was grieving, she picked up a copy of Western Union, which had been inscribed the day before, "To Dolly, from Zane." With her pen, she added, "Gone fishing on October 23, 1939.